Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dixie Vodka Postgame Show. My name is Brandon Adams. This is Jeff Sentell. Plenty to talk about today on a day when the Dogs have gotten a 45-14 win over the Vanderbilt Commodores, keeping a streak alive of really blowout performances here in the SEC, going back to last week's win against Tennessee, the week before that against Mississippi State. I think it's safe to say, with Missouri looming next Saturday, another home game, the Dogs would appear to be rolling right now.
I guess this is another game, Brandon, where Georgia covers the spread. They're well over, I think, the 17-point margin. That was for entertainment purposes only.
Of course.
Another great performance by the Bulldogs.
Yeah, we're going to talk to you a lot about it on today's show. Your questions and comments throughout. We'll get into all the big news of the day, both on the field. We'll continue to look back at UGA recruiting as well after the commitment from five-star quarterback Justin Fields yesterday. It'll be all brought to you today by Dixie Vodka here on the Dixie Vodka postgame show. You know, we tell you this all the time. The Dixie Vodka is a vodka made in the South by people from the South, for people like you and me right here in the South. And there are a lot of places you can find that around the South right now, including 5 Points Bottle Shop in Athens, Southern Beverage Outlet in Augusta, and Tower Beer, Wine, and Spirits in Atlanta. It's great to have Dixie Vodka here with us for the Dixie Vodka postgame show. And, you know, before we get into anything else from the game, I guess I want to start with this. You and I were talking about what the sort of indelible memories will be of this game. And I thought you brought up a good point before the show started, that this is another example of Georgia kind of coming out and taking over another stadium, the Georgia fan base. I think we've got a picture here from Seth Emerson on Twitter that we can show you of not a full stadium at Vanderbilt the way it was at Notre Dame, but look at all that red in Athens before the game begins. I think most of the people will tell you it's probably about 60-40 Georgia fans there in Nashville in comparison to Commodore fans. So just like Georgia fans kind of took over that Notre Dame stadium, the Vanderbilt stadium kind of taken over once again. And I guess you have to count the second half of last week's game in Knoxville as another stadium. Neyland Stadium in Knoxville was taken over by the Dogs.
Definitely, you have to sit there and think for a minute and get clever, Brandon, to think about when was the last time Georgia played in a hostile crowd for 4 quarters, because they've gotten in a habit, because of big games, fan support, whatever you want to call it, of basically turning the friendly confines of an opponent's stadium it's maybe their home turf.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk a lot about that. We'll talk to you in the comment section. Let me start with this, though, if you don't mind. I thought one of the real big stories of today's game was another performance by Nick Chubb. Now, most of this from Chubb came early, late in the game. You start getting the other UGA running backs involved. We'll talk more about them a little later on. But here you have Chubb kind of crossing that milestone. 4,000-plus rushing yards for his career. He surpasses Emmitt Smith on the all-time list, moves even closer to Herschel Walker. Of course, he won't be able to match the Herschel Walker total, but he puts some distance between himself and all the other running backs in the history of UGA. And I think you can make a case with Chubb adding to his total here today, going over the 4,000, that this is one of those guys that when you think about that special category of Georgia running backs, I think Nick Chubb is one of the names that's got to come to mind first and foremost. He and Todd Gurley, the two contemporary running backs that you talk about there. But even if you want to go back to the early 90s and 80s when the Georgia program was really known as running back university, you got to put Chubb in the mix with really any name you want to mention, probably just south of Herschel Walker.
Well, the number you think about there is you mentioned 4,000, and I guess the dedicated Georgia fan will say, come on, BA, I mean, Herschel's only 1,200 yards away. If you're counting yards, maybe Nick Chubb will play about maybe 10 more games this year, or at least maybe 9. I think the thing that you think of when you think of Nick Chubb, though, is you're going to think, okay, 4 years, this is a longevity record. I think it gets lost on a lot of people that you got to look at the year he was out. He only played through the Tennessee game that year. And really what Nick Chubb has done is really about, going on right now. You got to kind of look at that Tennessee year as a half season. So really whatever he puts up this year, you're going to look at it in about 3.5 years.
In our comment section, a lot of folks reacting to some of the other games taking place around the country. We'll be talking to you about some of those throughout the day as well, including Oklahoma and a bit of a struggle against Iowa State. We'll tell you about that when we can confirm that one has gone final. James Crump also talking about we cannot stretch the field deep. Auburn and Florida are going to be very close. We just talked about Nick Chubb and the offensive performance there. He also, James Crump, in the comments section says, yeah, but what I've seen from this Georgia offense gives me some concern in some of those crucial games that Georgia's going to play against Florida in a couple of weeks, against Auburn in the month of November. Are you seeing a Georgia offense right now that you think is going to be equal to those tasks when those bigger games for Georgia come along?
Well, I think that's all kind of circumstantial right there, because, Brandon, you got to sit there and you got to go, which team is going to push Georgia on both sides of the ball. You also got to think about, I guess the main thing that jumps out to me is even Kirby Smart mentioned it at the half. There were some comments where basically he thought the offense was picking it up for the defense on that day. There weren't enough 3-and-outs. They weren't tackling well. Vandy was taking some shots deep. We all kind of thought that was going to happen because Fritz Shurmur's son, that's the Vanderbilt cornerback, the Vanderbilt quarterback, throws it around pretty well, spins it around pretty well. Also, they were going to do some 7-on-7 stuff and attack Georgia, which is what you're going to do if you want to find maybe a weak spot in the armor. You want to try and attack those cornerbacks because that's the spot where maybe you would find some success against Georgia's defense.
All right, let me go away from the Georgia game here for a moment because we do have some breaking news here. You know, Georgia number 5 in the AP poll, already thinking about where it might be when you get to that first college football playoff ranking that comes out on October the 31st. Well, Georgia has an opportunity to move up in the polls that serve as the precursor for that because Oklahoma, one of the hottest teams in the country coming into today, a shocking upset loser to Iowa State here on this Saturday. That is a final. Sooners lose the game to an Iowa State program playing that at starting quarterback Jacob Park today. Park taking a break from Iowa State because of some personal health issues, going to be away from the team. His backup, though, comes in here, and the Cyclones pull a shocking upset against an Oklahoma team that, coming into today's game, maybe had the best win of anybody in the country when it went into Ohio Stadium and beat Ohio State. But major turmoil here in the national conversation as Oklahoma loses to Iowa State. And with Georgia playing the way that it's playing, what happens in the Big 12 there has big-time repercussions for Georgia because, as I said, this gives Georgia a real chance to climb up higher in the polls here.
Well, yeah, I think that's going to be a reminder for anybody in college football. They're going to sit there and look about, anybody can get beaten on any given day. You look at Iowa State, and they were without Jacob Park. That's their starter against a heavily favored Oklahoma team, and I think that's just indicative of anything can happen on any given Saturday, and you never know when one of those big-time teams can slip up. And remember, Baker Mayfield was one of the players on the short list for the Heisman Trophy this year, and now nobody's going to remember so much him planting that flag in the middle of the horseshoe right now. They're going to remember them getting snake bit a little bit by Iowa State.
Pretty interesting comment by Kevin and Charity Terry in the comment section here about what this means for Georgia, and I think they touch on it perfectly, that when you see those top 4 rankings come out tonight, the unofficial ones from like Joey Galloway and all the guys on ESPN, the former Florida quarterback that's on there as well. When they're giving out their top 4 rankings tonight, I would imagine you're going to see Georgia in those top 4s. Now, this is obviously still early in the season. Those are unofficial opinions, just like we share here on the Dixie Vodka postgame show. That doesn't really matter, but it does speak to, at least for now, how much things have shifted for Georgia going back to last season. Last season, Georgia lost in homecoming to Vanderbilt, and last season, people wondered, does Georgia have the right coach in Kirby Smart in his first year? Here we are 12 months later, and on ESPN broadcast tonight and the SEC network and everything else, it's going to be Georgia mentioned in top 4s starting tonight, and the Dogs have an opportunity to keep themselves there for the rest of the season. That is how dramatically and quickly fortunes have changed here for Georgia. Oklahoma's loss opens up an opportunity for the Dogs to potentially play for the national championship if it keeps performing the way that it is right now.
I tell you what, Brandon, this is like, 2 or 3 broadcasts in a row where I'm going to give you dabbling in brilliance right here, because that thought tree you just went through there kind of stumbles on what I think is maybe the main entree of conversation from this Georgia game, and whether you want to call it rich programs problems or something like that. I think our jobs here as commentators is to place the right perspective on everything that happens here with Georgia football. And I've got my phone, which I can kind of call my own personal message board, with lots of people weighing in. They're saying, this game was over by the half. Yeah. This is the way it should be with Georgia plays Vanderbilt every year. It's just not entertaining. There was no contest. People are sitting there going, like, this game was great, but it should have been a shutout. This game was great, but Georgia gave Vandy too many rushing yards. Not as many brilliant rushing yards, or the totals didn't look as good as what Alabama did and what Florida did. And here's where I'm going to give you just a little bit of perspective here, Dog Nation. Not going to sound preachy, but this is 1 year removed from Georgia losing to this same Vanderbilt team on homecoming. And now the Bulldogs go on the road, minus some key personnel on the defensive side of the ball, with, again, a freshman quarterback. Yeah. And somehow the style points, the jazziness, the sexiness of a 45-14 humbling of Vanderbilt in Commodore Stadium is not good enough.
Well, Blake Wilson, to go to your point, makes a great point about Georgia's performance against Vanderbilt in comparison to Oklahoma losing to Iowa State. What Blake says in the comment section, this is 100% true, is that Oklahoma losing to the Cyclones just shows you how easy it is to lose focus for a Saturday in college football. We obviously all know that Oklahoma is much better on paper than Iowa State is, but maintaining that edge Saturday in and Saturday out is not an easy thing to do. I think Georgia deserves a little credit here for the fact that it was able to make as you said, a game like Vanderbilt, make that game boring, make that game easy. But Georgia maintained its focus enough to kind of go out there and get the dominant blowout win once again. It's one of the things about Kirby Smart that you like. He is making practice right now so tough that the games are easy, and he's finding a way to make each game its own source of motivation. So Georgia not looking ahead to Florida in a few weeks, content to make Vanderbilt the only game it was capable of playing and winning on this day, and Georgia doing what Oklahoma couldn't, which is getting an easy win and an overmatched opponent. I think Blake's comment in the comment section, Jeff, is actually a really good one.
You know, I'm gonna ring the chapel bell on that one. That was pretty much dead on, because to me, here's the way I look at these football games, Brandon, is that I believe in my heart of hearts that there are only maybe 3 or 4 times this season where a football team can hear the rah-rah speech. They can foam at the mouth. They can breathe fire. They can go out and play off raw emotion and find a way to win, find a way to beat a team. Now, this is a game coaches absolutely love, because it's a game where it's all about focus and execution. You can say Georgia went into Tennessee game with some momentum for Chubb for last year, the Hail Mary. The week before that, they had to make a statement, a signature against Mississippi State. You can even look at Notre Dame. Those are games where Georgia had to come in with a whole lot of want to and let's get it done. This Vanderbilt game is simply a game of being more talented, being more physical, focusing better, and executing better. And Georgia's able to do that. The game was never really in doubt. They played smash-mouth football from the jump, ran all over Vanderbilt. There was a point there where, Sony Michel was well over 100. Yeah. Nick Chubb was well over 100. Then you're thinking, is it going to be Elijah Holyfield that gets 100 next? Is it going to be DeAndre Swift who gets it next? I just think this was a good example of Georgia getting it done and not allowing any drama to seep in there at all.
I want to talk about Jake Fromm with you in just a minute. Before I get to Fromm, let me go to another comment here. It's from Steve Shaffini, who, by the way, was with us on our Dog Nation invasion to South Bend. We appreciate him weighing in the comment section today. And he brought up a point that one of our producers, Mark, and I were talking about before the show started here today, and that is the consecutive blowouts put together for Georgia. And what we figured is, not counting the Samford game, but just SEC games, that's 3 consecutive SEC wins by more than 28 points. Now, last couple weeks, way more than that, but that's 3 consecutive 28-plus point SEC wins for Georgia. I'd love to have some of our longtime Georgia fans, or just people who are really good at working the Google button. We were having a hard time figuring out, how far back in the past do you have to go to find Georgia roasting 3 consecutive SEC opponents the way that it has Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and Mississippi State the last 3 weeks? The truth is, I had to jog my memory for a long time, and I'm still not sure I can figure out what year it would have been that Georgia was just launching SEC teams the way that it is right now.
I would probably say that's indicative of going back to one of those great Georgia teams that comes around every 5 years. Yeah. First 2 places I would look in the media guide is 2007, 2012. Because that's the way, especially the back end of the year when Georgia was rolling in a high level, that's when Georgia was really clicking its stride after an early season hiccup. And those are the games I would look forward to see when they are really just getting it done.
All right, Tom Raymond's got a great quote. I said we'll talk about Fromm, and we will, but this comment's too good to bring up. Tom Raymond says, I will tell you one thing, hashtag Roquan for Heisman for real. That man does everything and has not missed one thing as a defender. He's the best playmaker in all of college football. You are so spot on about that. And first of all, this is a hot button topic for me on 2 fronts. A, I think it's ridiculous that defensive players don't ever get mentioned in the Heisman Trophy, because you cannot tell me right now that if you're going to have a flat out honest conversation about the best player in college football, you cannot tell me that Roquan Smith is not on the short list of best players in college football. Now, y'all know he's not going to win the Heisman Trophy, because that's not how this sport works. It's, a glory award for quarterbacks and running backs. But you can't tell me that Roquan is not on the very short list of best players. I'm not telling you he is the best, and it may be a homerish opinion for me to say that, but you can't tell me that he's not in that conversation.
Yeah, I think, to me, it is kind of somewhat possible, I think, to get to New York. I think that might be the campaign, to just get to the downtown athletic club. Remember, Manti Te'o made it when Notre Dame had their run. And
Roquan's got a real girlfriend, by the way.
He's probably got several real girlfriends if he wants them, the way he's playing. I'm gonna say this about things right there. For the recipe for Georgia, for, think about Roquan, the right thing for Roquan right there, the way he's playing. Number one, he's definitely deserving it. But the second thing is you have to be on a top 5 team and you have to maybe be the best player on the top 5 team if you want to rally some sort of national All-American, Heisman, Bednarik, Lombardi, Butkus Award recognition for a linebacker. But, I mean, you see the timeline, and some Georgia fans like to enjoy a beverage when they
maybe a little Dixie Vodka
when they watch college football.
A little Dixie Vodka in a red Solo cup. I wouldn't put that past some of our audience.
I'm not breaking any news by saying that some people like to enjoy a cocktail with their college football on Saturdays. That's no intel right there, anybody. But what I will say is that some people have fashioned together some sort of, I think it's called a drinking game, Brandon. I've never heard of this before. But what they're doing is every time Roquan Smith's name is called, they would basically sample their concoction in an adult, reasonable manner, of course.
Of course, responsibly. All right, we got more of your comments coming up. It's the Dixie Vodka postgame show. That's Jeff Sentell. My name's Brandon Adams. It's great to have you with us. Of course, Dixie Vodka, the South's best tasting vodka. They bring the Dixie Vodka postgame show to you each and every week here on Dog Nation. Of course, you can find Dixie Vodka at 5 Points Bottle Shop in Athens, Southern Beverage Outlet in Augusta, Tower Beer, Wine, and Spirits in Atlanta. Just some of the places serving up Dixie Vodka. We appreciate them doing that. Of course, appreciate you being with us here for the Dixie Vodka postgame show. Now, let me transition, talk about Jake Fromm just for a moment. Corey Ray said in the comment section that this is Jake Fromm's team right now. I know you believe that. I think today was a day that, and we'll look at the overall final stats here in a moment, but I think overall this was a day when I think Fromm took another step towards earning confidence, both from fans, probably his own players, which I think they probably are kind of rallying around him a little bit anyway. But it was a solid day, I thought, for Fromm, a day in which Fromm really looked like he is the Georgia quarterback.
Yeah, I think most analysts have kind of tried to weigh that. I'm the team guy. I worry about what happens if Eason gets the job. And I think that's kind of a wishy-washy way to look at it. I'm going to just say this very simply. I don't think there's any quarterback controversy in Athens whatsoever. You saw Fromm was in the game basically when the score was 42-7 and 35-7. There is no controversy, and it's not maybe how Jacob Eason was still trying to knock off the rust in the second half. It's just how well Fromm manages a game plan, and I hate that term, game manager, because anybody can be a game manager and hike the ball and hand it off. That's what a game manager is. I'm talking about a win manager there when I think about Jake Fromm, and there's so many plays. I got so many coaches in my phone that text me after every game, and they're like, I didn't know about this Fromm kid. I've heard a little bit about it, but they even go see him or they go watch Georgia Live, and they say the little things that even the best broadcaster somehow doesn't pick up, like the early play.
Or the worst broadcasters like Mike Patrick and Tommy Tuberville on today's game.
Speaking of people that fell over their feet.
Sorry to cut you off. I just feel like I got to sneak that in.
Yeah, because that's going to be one of the storylines of this game. Everybody's going to say, hey, man, how bad were those announcers on Saturday?
Pretty bad.
Pretty bad. And then we could go ad nauseum about that. But the thing that people notice about Fromm, there was a really early play where there was the thought, sort of looked like a lot like last week with him had his eyes locked on Nada for a little bit, but he looked off Nada and then made the check down to another guy for a big play for Georgia. And this is the little things that Jake Fromm does. He does things. Now, he's still going to get chewed out. He's still going to make mistakes. But one thing you won't see is him repeating those mistakes a second or third time.
We'll show you all the game stats coming up in just a moment. Let me just give you the Fromm stats for right now. 7-11, 102 yards, 2 touchdowns. He also rushes for 36 more. And while 11 attempts does not sound like a big game, you use the phrase game manager, Fromm's over 9 yards per attempt today. That's not a game manager stat. 9 yards per attempt. Now, it's not a lot of throws necessarily, but 9+ yards per attempt is a lot higher than a typical game manager stat. That's actually a pretty efficient day for Fromm throwing the football, even though right now with this Georgia team, because it's got 9,000 running backs, you're not going to ask Fromm to throw it a whole lot, but a guy that's giving you, nearly 10 yards per attempt, that's a pretty good day from that young man.
Brandon, it makes me cough, gets me all choked up about this, Brandon, this topic right here. It's just simple football. You feed the ball to your horses. Georgia looks like it has at least 3 future NFL running backs in its stable, maybe even 4 the way Elijah Holyfield keeps grinding and everything else. They have right now what I see, maybe 1 future NFL starter at receiver at the most. You want to put the ball in the running back's hands. That's just smart football, especially with a freshman quarterback. And everybody that makes those thoughts about, Fromm's arm, doesn't have the big-time arm strength compared to number 10. He throws a very impressive deep ball. Another great piece of film today with that long strike he hit today.
Oh, yeah. Godwin, right? 48-yard touchdown.
48 yards to Terry Godwin. And he is a very accurate passer, especially with the deep ball. And, you know, he may not have the arm that Jacob Eason does, but he clearly shows when he gets the chance to stretch the field, he's putting that ball on his guys quite often.
A lot of comments about Fromm coming in here. Mard Rashad says Fromm trucked somebody today. He doesn't shy away from contact. Brian Murphy says all Fromm all the time. PC Cooper, not DB Cooper, but PC Cooper says Fromm did exactly what was expected. I think that's probably true, and the expectations for him are kind of rising too, by the way. Diedrich Frazier brings up a good point. Think about how much better Fromm will be next year, and that's interesting. We'll talk about Justin Fields later on today's show, but I know that you're a big believer. As much love as Fields is justifiably getting, this idea that the sophomore version of Jake Fromm is going to take a back seat to Fields, that's going to be just as intense, probably even more intense of a conversation next year and a competition next year than Eason and Fromm was this spring.
Definitely so, and I think those young men both have very impressive character traits, very impressive tools in their skill set. But I think the main thing with there is when basically the only thing Jake Fromm needed, everybody keeps making that point about how Jake Fromm got beat out, or Jacob Eason beat out Jake Fromm. I just continue to look at it as Jacob Eason had a huge lead on Jake Fromm to begin the year. And I used a golf analogy one time trying to share it with some people at one of our remotes recently, is I think going off 13 starts, I think Jacob Eason had a 13-shot lead on Jake Fromm going into this year. I think maybe by the time fall practice rode around, maybe that lead was down to 2 or 3 shots, but that was still a lead. And I just think every time Fromm plays, he gets a little bit better. He shows a little bit more out of his game. He refines the way he plays and makes strides from week to week to week. Film don't lie, folks. If you look at Fromm's best, all of his games so far, put that together as a six-pack right there for Jake Fromm so far, that collection of 6 starts for Jake Fromm just looks very, very good.
J.J. Parrish says Fromm's playing amazing for a freshman, and he says workhorses. I believe he means workhorses. No, this is not a Dickens novel. Our workhorses are helping him relax and not have to do too much, and I think that really is true, that Fromm, as a freshman, probably feels like he hit the Powerball lotto because he's playing behind a better offensive line right now than Jacob Eason was last year. And how much easier is it for a quarterback to get comfortable knowing that if you get into real trouble, all you got to do is turn around and do this, and the guy that you give it to is probably going to be just fine. I don't think Fromm's performance this season should be discounted because I think he's getting better with every game. But, man, it helps to have those running backs, Jeff.
It does, but, I mean, what Georgia has with Fromm is here's the example of they can take what the defense gives them. They call it football math a lot. Coaches I know, they call it count the box. It's called box football. The defense dictates what you do, and when those guys are all backed off, those guys are all backed off in the box, then they're going to run the football with that stable. When those guys are all creeping up and there's too many people in the box, Georgia's going to take its strikes, and they're going to do so with a guy that knows how to play action and a guy that can throw the deep ball and can stretch the field in Jake Fromm. I think he is just a very efficient passer. We make all these terms about, you know, what does Georgia look like when they had Alabama. I think maybe a great comparison for Jake Fromm is to compare him to Greg McElroy, to compare him to John Parker Wilson, who was the quarterback for the second year of Nick Saban down there in Tuscaloosa, when they had their turnaround in their first breakthrough season where they got to the SEC championship game before they lost to Florida. Think about A.J. McCarron as well. I think Fromm is doing all those things that those guys did for Alabama.
Let me change the subject, hit a couple comments, and then I want to look at the final stats from the game, our Dixie Vodka final stats. We'll do that here coming up in just a moment. First of all, I'm getting a lot of comments in the comment section about McCole Hardman. Should he go back to defensive back? He's not a wide receiver yet. I got to tell you, this is an issue in which I think Georgia fans should be patient. First of all, I believe when it's all said and done, I think Hardman's going to have a really good career at Georgia on the offensive side of the ball. I think that all of us at times are guilty of underestimating just how difficult it is to learn the wide receiver position, all the facets that go along with that, including hauling in those catches. I think that takes a little bit of time here. I think his athleticism is so dynamic. You see that in his punt returns when he's out there doing that. I think Hardman on offense is where he needs to be. I would have loved to see him work as a defensive back. They tried that experiment. That didn't quite click. I think Hardman's going to have a good career eventually on the offensive side of the ball for Georgia. And frankly, I'm glad to see guys like Javon Wims and Terry Godwin stepping up so that Hardman doesn't have to be Georgia's #1 weapon, because right now, in terms of his sure-handedness, he's just not quite there yet.
Yeah, and it's just so funny. I started out the broadcast with one of the comments like, rich programs problems or first world problems. You're going to hear people talking about this football game, and McCole Hardman will be one of those warts. You're going to look at the defense. You're going to look at the rushing yards. Again, the tight ends didn't have a monster game today, but Man, Georgia football has played a lot of games where they fed the tight ends or one receiver went off for a bunch of yards and they still lost. Or, like Isaiah McKenzie last year is a great example. McCole Hardman, what if he would be having Isaiah McKenzie type production right now for Georgia, but then the wins wouldn't be happening? Remember, Nauta caught a lot of balls last year, but the wins weren't happening. It was an up and down season. I just kind of think that, these are things that Georgia fans are going to have to get used to, is finding things to say, Georgia was great win, happy with it, checked a lot of boxes, but, insert the blank here, but insert the blank here. These are just things that fans, when they're harping and they're looking for things to talk about, perspective, again, is so very
well,
big.
And that's the other comment I wanted to mention before we look at the final stats here. Sean Manzioni in the comment section says, hey, y'all slow down. Not just you and me, but all of us. Slow down. This is a Vanderbilt team that got beat 59-0 by Alabama. That is true. From a final score standpoint, Alabama did throttle Vanderbilt by more than Georgia did. But it's 45-14 this Saturday. It was 41-0 the week before that. It was a, slaughterhouse against Mississippi State back in Athens the week before that. To say that there's somehow a great deal of difference between the way that Alabama is beating up on people and the way that Georgia's beating up on people, right now there's not that big of a difference. Alabama's still beating people by worse, but to act like that somehow Georgia's opponents are any less demoralized after games against Georgia than Bama's opponents are right now, I think that's discounting what Georgia's been able to do this far this season. Georgia has really humbled its last three SEC teams. That's the kind of thing that is worth giving a little bit of praise to Georgia for. And if you're a Georgia fan, that's the kind of thing you ought to be able to crow about a little bit here too, I think.
I think if you were the most staunchest critic and you were the ultimate half-empty type person and you wanted to pick every nit possible, I want you to do this for me real fast as a favor, friend. I want you to look through Georgia's 6 ball games right now. I want you to analyze them and give them a letter grade for how well each team has played on the season. I don't think that the Bulldogs would register anything lower than a B in every performance so far this year. And that's just being very conservative as well.
That's Jeff Sentell. My name is Brandon Adams. It's the Dixie Vodka postgame show, and I will tell you 45-14 our final score today as Georgia gets a big, easy win on Vanderbilt. Of course, the Dixie Vodka postgame show is brought to you by our friends at Dixie Vodka, the South's best-tasting vodka. Made in the South by people from the South for people in the South. And you know what? When it comes to college football, there's a lot of debates, especially in this region of the country. But something that's not up for debate, the fact that Dixie Vodka is the South's best-tasting vodka. We know that's for sure. You can check that out at 5 Points Bottle Shop in Athens, Southern Beverage Outlet in Augusta, Tower Beer, Wine, and Spirits in Atlanta. Let's take a look at our final stats here from the game. Well, let's see just how dominant it was for Georgia against Vanderbilt. You see Vanderbilt does get a little going offensively, at least compared to what Tennessee did last week. They will go north of 200 yards here today. 64 yards rushing. Kyle Shermer, pretty good quarterback, does get 172 through the air as well. But how about Georgia with 423 rushing yards on today's game? That's the real story. And of course, the one turnover does belong to Jacob Eason, who we'll talk about in a moment there. So a little more offense from Vanderbilt than probably you've seen from the last couple of opponents, certainly Tennessee last week. Expand on that a little bit more. I know you were just touching on that.
Yeah, just to me, that looks like one of those old school 1990s Nebraska performances right there where you have 423 yards of rushing. And I know Georgia fans, I think they probably think this way, but everybody sees 45-14 and they think, much like maybe the Appalachian State game, much like the Sanford game, they scored a late garbage touchdown against the Twos, and that game really should be a 45-7. There was a consequence there made by Jacob Eason and that late play where he got slammed in the back. Tommy Tuberville, who was probably not on the mark with not a lot of his analysis on the day. One of the things I think he got right is that Eason, whether you want to call it trying to knock off some rust or what have you, makes a pre-snap read. The blitzer does come in very late, but his shoulders were turned away from that side of the field and got blasted, gives up the ball, and then there was the pressure coming from the opposite side of the field. It looked like somebody got by Ben Cleveland, and he was able to scoop the ball and almost score, and then they also dissected whether or not Ben Cleveland basically tried to put a power bomb on the Vanderbilt defender as he was going on the end zone.
We'll talk more about Jacob Eason coming up in a moment. Let me go back to the Georgia defense here, because I think one of the things this defense, when it heads back from Nashville to Athens, will be thinking about was that touchdown streak that had been trying to protect. It does come to an end today. It had been 31 straight opponent drives in which Georgia had not allowed a touchdown. That spans 163 minutes and 21 seconds of game time, but Vanderbilt does find the end zone today. And I thought that was kind of an interesting thing that Kirby Smart talked about when he spoke to the sideline reporter on the ESPN broadcast at halftime today, saying, hey, our offense had to carry us in the first half of this, when it's really mostly been the defense kind of carrying Georgia for the most part this season. Kind of an interesting statement from Smart to make there, and a day in which the Georgia defense probably was at least a quarter step below what it had been the last couple of weeks, and probably the Notre Dame game too.
You know, kind of one of the big picture points me and you were hashing before the show, Brandon, is we kind of talked about in-game theory a little bit with Georgia Bulldogs and their season, and I don't know if Georgia will face, maybe a potential future for Georgia is they won't face a offense and a vertical downfield passing threat that will really challenge them until maybe their penultimate game of the season, when they might face Alabama in the SEC championship game. I don't think Florida is going to be able to deliver that. I think Auburn would make a living off the dink and dunk short throws when they face the Bulldogs on the plane. But I'm just curious how Georgia would attack a true downfield passing threat. It's no secret you don't need to be Irk Russell to figure out that Georgia's weak link on defense is its cornerbacks. And you saw Vanderbilt was attacking those with a lot of deep shots. DeAndre Baker, he made a great play on a ball that was going basically across the middle of the field. And I just kind of wonder if Georgia was playing a big-time arm, a big-time passing team, whether or not Georgia would maybe protect its corners with maybe bracketed coverage or guys over the top, much like Jeremy Pruitt did a few years ago.
Waylon Harper in the comments section says we have no pass rush. I don't think that's the case. Georgia's pass rush won the game against Notre Dame. I think Georgia's been in a position here the last few weeks where it knew it could play conservatively. And to go back to your point, Kyle Sherman did have some passing yards today. Last week, I thought Tennessee had some open receivers. Now, it just so happens that Quentin Dormady, the Tennessee quarterback for most of the game last Saturday, missed some open men, but we saw some vulnerability for Georgia last week against Tennessee as well. And it's worth going back. For those of you that save these games on DVR, go back and watch the Mississippi State game. Clearly, Mississippi State thought its best chance of winning was attacking deep down the field. It made several long throws, trying to challenge DeAndre Baker that day. Baker was equal to the task. Look at the start of the Notre Dame game. Notre Dame clearly thought it needed to challenge Georgia's secondary. It just so happened that day it could not block Georgia's outside linebacker, so that part of the game plan never fully materialized. But we have seen thus far a lot of opposing offenses think their best chance to challenge Georgia is to try to get enough protection to take the deep shots down the field. That is one of those things that Georgia does have to correct if it's going to take the championship steps before the end of the season.
Yeah, that's kind of game planning 101, Brandon. What you want to do when you're a defensive staff is you want to look at them and say, okay, I'm going to take away what they do best. I'm going to take away their biggest strength on offense and make them beat me in some other area. You got to remember, Vanderbilt has its leading rusher in Ralph Webb down there in the backfield, and they end up with 64 total rushing yards and really nothing in the final quarter. And they forced Georgia to say, okay, come on, see what you can do, try to beat us through the air. And Vanderbilt was not able to do so. And everybody's going to try to do that with Georgia. They're going to try and pick on those cornerbacks a little bit. Georgia fans should probably feel a lot better that Malcolm Parrish is back, and that makes that weak spot maybe a little less vulnerable.
Let me give you some more breaking news here. It's been a college football Saturday of breaking news, and this one potentially bad news for Florida. The Florida-LSU game just underway, and Kadarius Toney, who's a wide receiver for Florida, but also a Wildcat quarterback, one of those guys that was really, to a certain extent, in the competition to be Florida's starter going back to the spring, and a guy that drew some conversation there during the summer as well. Toney leaves the game with an ankle injury, what looks to be an ankle injury, at least 3 plays into the game against LSU. This is, remember, for Florida here, injuries are starting to become a little bit of a story. Tyree Cleveland, the wide receiver, he's not playing today. Luke Del Rio, who was the starting quarterback, named so by Jim McElwain after the Kentucky game, he's done for the season with an injury. Of course, Florida also dealing with 9 suspensions, including, on paper, the 2 best offensive players from the start of the year, Jordan Scarlett, the running back, Antonio Callaway, the leading receiver. They're not with the team right now as well. So another one of those Florida playmakers that had emerged this season, Kadarius Toney, out. We'll find out how long he is out, if he is indeed out for the entire game, but ankle injuries for a speedster are always a serious deal here. So Toney out for Florida against LSU, that's a significant storyline because this is a Florida team getting really thin at that playmaker spot.
Well, they already didn't have a cornucopia of playmakers anyway. Offensively, they needed to squeeze all the all the juice out of that lemon they possibly could. And I think this is a great story. What goes through my mind when I hear a story like that is the same reminders. This is football. This is a physical game. Seasons are measures of attrition and depth. And the Bulldog faithful, they're sitting there wondering about rushing yards and the late touchdowns. Better be awfully thankful that most of the bullets that were in the holster are going to be back for Missouri. Natrez Patrick is going to miss some time. There's going to be a few injuries here and there, but relatively speaking, the Bulldogs have been pretty much okay on the injury front.
And here's the thing, too. If you want to do the side-by-side comparison between Georgia and Florida, you wrote about this the other day. I've talked about this a lot on Dog Nation Daily. Jim McElwain has not been a good recruiter for Florida. And one of the reasons why coming into this season I thought that Georgia was going to have the edge over the Gators, even though Florida's won some of those recent games on the field, is Florida's team recruiting class, the class of 2015, outside the top 20. The last two classes for the last 2 years finished outside the top 10. Now, 2018 is probably going to be a pretty good class for McElwain, but the absence of depth at Florida is directly attributed to the misses that McElwain's had in recruiting. Tony was only a 3-star prospect. Malik Davis, just a 3-star running back. Florida's having to turn to 3-star players more so than it ever has in the past. And when someone gets hurt, the backup is not the same caliber of player. While Georgia fans don't want any injuries, look at what Georgia has. Depth at running back, even depth at wide receiver that right now Florida can't match. Certainly depth in the real key positions on defense. Kirby Smart's success in his first 2 recruiting classes give Georgia a talent advantage right now that I don't believe that Florida can match.
Maybe the stat I should go cook up and look up, maybe, Brandon, is to look at the 3 stars and 4 stars left on the field or left in the 2 deep for both of those schools right now, because you made valid points about what Florida has kind of under-recruited over the last few years. They haven't outkicked their coverage in terms of the 4 stars and the 5 stars. And when you take those guys off the field through injury, through those suspensions, through lack of performance, I think the differences between the 2 programs do become very telling. And hey, I'm the recruiting guy, but I don't think Georgia and Florida are going to be in any sort of head-to-head tail of the tapes comparisons for much longer. One program is definitely skyrocketing in that area.
All right, let me do this. I want to give you a couple more breaking news items from earlier today. I want to reset some of those. I've got some more comments that I want to read. Then we'll get back to everything that we're doing here on the Dixie Vodka postgame show. If you're just joining us, we just told you about Kadarius Toney leaving the game early against LSU with what looks to be an ankle injury. That's a significant loss for Florida. No matter how long Toney's out, they really need him to make plays both this Saturday against LSU. It's Texas A&M the following week for the Gators, a bye week, then Georgia. You start thinking about that cocktail party a little bit. That's not the only big news today, though. We told you earlier that Oklahoma does lose on this Saturday to Iowa State. Iowa State playing without its starting quarterback, Jacob Park, the former UGA quarterback, has left the team right now. He's dealing with a medical situation, kind of an undisclosed deal with him. He's taken some time away from football, and in his stead, the backup steps in, beats the Sooners. For a Georgia team ranked number 5 in the AP poll coming into this week, that means Georgia probably climbs into the top 4, both in terms of the actual official polls and the unofficial polls here as well. And we'll start to take our eye on October the 31st when the first college football rankings come out, and the idea that Georgia at that time, assuming it continues to roll here, could be in the conversation for the college football playoff. Another big piece of news, speaking of college football playoff contenders, the defending national champion Clemson, their starting quarterback, Kelly Bryant, also left the game today. Now, no update from me right now on Bryant's status. We'll hear more about that throughout the week. You can check out diehards.com for more on that. But we know that Clemson's got some depth at quarterback with Zarek Cooper and Hunter Johnson. Dabo certainly recruited well at the quarterback position. But we saw a lot of those guys having to come in and play today because Kelly Bryant, who had been really humming for the Tigers, he goes out of the game today. So a lot of big news here on this college football Saturday.
Yeah, Brandon, I think when everything gets sliced and diced for this season, I think Georgia is definitely, in every indication they've given through consistently excellent performances, as we touched on earlier, Georgia's a top 4 team in the country.
Yeah.
And they're on a collision course for Alabama in the SEC championship game. I know that is looking extremely far ahead, but we're here to project and we're here to analyze and we're here to say what we think will happen. And I'm not breaking any limbs or going off on any tangents right there. Georgia is playing like one of the top 4 teams in the country. that will represent the East in the SEC championship game.
I want to talk about the Georgia running backs here in just a moment. Another comment, though, I want to hit from the comment section comes from Dylan Flood, who said that he looks at the interior of the Georgia defense today, and he felt like he saw this group not playing quite as well today as it has earlier in the season. Do you attribute that, or how much of that do you attribute to the absence of Natrez Patrick, Georgia's number 3 overall tackler coming into the game today? Obviously, he's looking at a 4-game suspension because of his arrest for marijuana on Thursday night. How much of what happened for the Georgia defense today, giving up some yards in the middle, was because Patrick wasn't in there?
I don't think that. I think Jawan Taylor and Monty Rice, especially given their limited sample size of reps so far this year, I think Monty Rice and Taylor did just fine. Number 44 was flashing across the field and made a bunch of big plays. I think maybe the thing it's more indicative of is the guys up front, guys not beating blocks. Kirby Smart always talks about block protection and then winning the matchup and having one guy come free at all times. And I think the situation there is just, as I stated earlier, there's only so many games where you're going to give a dominating, physically impose your will on a guy type effort. And this was more like a go about maybe a Wednesday afternoon at the office sales management presentation. Just do your job, do what you're paid to do what you're trained to do what your experience allows you to do. And I think Georgia, again, everybody's going to sit there and look for things to look at in terms of this win. And not a perfect win by any means. Maybe this is a solid B performance here for Georgia in terms of they beat the brakes off somebody, but didn't kill it with the style points. I just think that's a measure. Folks have to remember 1 year ago at this time, this was a homecoming loss to Vanderbilt.
Yeah. Alan Frazier, by the way, in the comment section pointing out Kadarius Toney is back in for Florida, so we'll continue to watch how that Florida-LSU game works out. And I agree with what somebody else in the comment section a moment ago, too, that this is a Florida team that continues to win. Now, we'll see what happens against the Tigers today there in Gainesville, but Florida right now has something that, that Georgia was chasing. Today, Georgia's gotten its 3rd SEC win, but a Florida win here would give them a 4th. So Florida may be skating by. They may have been lucky thus far, but Florida continuing to win here continues to put pressure on Georgia to do the very same thing. And y'all know, if you listen and watch Dog Nation Daily every single day, we talk about that Gatorade countdown each and every day. There's a reason why we do it. And these two teams for the moment, Jeff, look like they're on a real collision course to decide the SEC East.
Brandon, truth serum question here, man.
Please, by all means.
Do you want Florida to take 2 losses in the SEC heading into Jacksonville for the big game? Or do you want to see an unbeaten Florida facing the Bulldogs in Jacksonville?
Okay, so I never need a reason to cheer for Florida to lose, so I'm going to be short-sighted in the LSU game and the Texas A&M game. I always want Florida to lose, but I got to tell you, if they don't, there's going to be nothing more satisfied for long-time Georgia fans, nothing more satisfying than the idea of going into Jacksonville and crushing Florida's soul, taking it from them right there on the field. And as we've been saying, the T-shirts say, own the East. That step's going to happen in Jacksonville one way or another, no matter what Florida's record is. So it's going to be a sweet victory in Jacksonville no matter what.
You know what I think Georgia fans can take heed to and learn about this game, and what we've always talked about with lots of positions is the games themselves will dictate. Let the matter play out. Let the season play out. And number one, I know the boys will be ready to play in Jacksonville for that game. There's no doubt about that, especially after the bye week. And then especially, they're going to have the Missouri game next week. That'll be another late game and another late kickoff. And then that will give Georgia lots of time to get all their froth and vigor and venom and everything ready to go for that annual cocktail party clash in Jacksonville.
By the way, take a look at that right there. Michael, who works with us, he puts that Gatorade countdown up on the screen. They do that every day for me on Dog Nation Daily. And why not fit that on the Dixie Vodka postgame show as well? By the way, speaking of the Dixie Vodka postgame show, that's Jeff Sentell. My name's Brandon Adams. This is the Dixie Vodka postgame show. And it's great to have Dixie Vodka with us. We say it all the time, they are the South's best tasting vodka. And if you haven't tried it yet, you can try it, and you will certainly agree with that as well. And if you're saying, well, where's some of the spots I can find Dixie Vodka? Well, in addition to a lot of the bars around the South, how about 5 Points Bottle Shop in Athens? If you're in Augusta, check out Southern Beverage Outlet there, or Tower Beer, Wine, and Spirits in Atlanta. You can check yourself out some Dixie Vodka and have a good time with that. All right, plenty more comments coming up in a moment. Let's talk about these Georgia running backs here, though, because I think that Georgia as a program really flexes its muscles the most right now when it's getting all these different backs involved in the game. You saw, Sony Michel moving piles today. You saw DeAndre Swift catch a touchdown. Elijah Holyfield got a chance to burst through the middle, get himself a touchdown. And didn't he run towards pay dirt with real authority, because I know he's eager to get some playing time, and he made the most of his chance today. He got himself a touchdown. We talked about Nick Chubb going over 4,000 career rushing yards. Brian Herring probably not as big a part of this today, but he looked, really good to me last week, and I believe that Brian Herring is a good running back. I mean, it's not uncommon for Georgia to have more than one good running back at the same time, but this really is. I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches for the Dogs at the running back position.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Brandon, and I mean, it's another thing there where you talk about what Georgia didn't do this and there offensively, tight ends or whatever. Not a big game for McColl, not really big catch games, but let's look at what the football game was and how it unfolded. Georgia led 21-0 early. It became 21-7. Then they took another and they moved the advantage margin forward once the second half began. And you can say a lot of things about what Georgia didn't show, and we've kind of covered a lot of those in the comment sections. But here's what you did show. You saw a guy like Elijah Holyfield getting in the end zone. You saw a guy sitting there watching him run the ball and run hard and think to yourself, oh, man, I'm so glad Elijah's in the end zone. I'm so glad to see that young man do well and have some success. You also see a guy, a name that Georgia fans have been hoping to hear from for a long time. Jeremiah J.J. Holloman catches a pass today for Georgia.
Okay, that's nice to mention that. Thanks for bringing that up.
As a Georgia Bulldog. And, I mean, you guys want new names? You guys want to know who will be maybe the playmakers for Georgia in the back half of the year? I'm still thinking J.J. Holloman. Before everything is said and done, at some point of his freshman year, J.J. Holloman is going to make a lot of people in Covington very proud.
Hamstring probably cleared up now. I know he dealt with that a lot in the summer, and maybe that set him back a little bit. Georgia's also not throwing the ball very much. That makes it hard for a guy like that to get some stats. I tell you, another guy you got to pay attention to here. In the game early last week against Tennessee, was targeted once today. That's Trey Blunt. Trey Blunt is a part of this wide receiver rotation right now.
Maybe we need to mention Trey Blunt's name about 2 or 3 more extra times because he was compared to someone else earlier in that broadcast.
Yeah, poor Mike Patrick called him McCole Hardman for about 5 minutes before he finally realized that was not Hardman, that was Trey Blunt. Yeah, so we'll give Blunt credit for getting the target. Now, he doesn't haul in the pass, but he was at least targeted there.
I'm going to tell you what, Trey Blunt, very happy to see that young man succeed and excel because, remember, you have another SEC road game, Brandon. You have a situation where only 70 guys are going to get to go on that bus and make that trip. Mm-hmm. And Trey Blunt, when I see him on the trip, when I see him getting reps early, when I see him in the game, that tells me that Trey Blunt is doing everything he needs to do in practice. He is putting in good reps. And remember, I remember Trey Blunt telling me this when I was talking to him in his junior year. He said, I got to block. That's what his dad always told him. You got to block if you want the rock.
Yeah, I love that line. It's one of my favorite.
Can't get the rock, got to block to get the rock. And what Trey Blunt's done is he's doing everything he needs to do in practice. He's moving it up that depth chart. He's getting on the travel squad, and he's getting his name called incorrectly and correctly in SEC road games during his freshman year. And everybody wants to talk about, freshman performers and where's the touchdowns and where's the Sports Center plays. That's the truly special freshman like a DeAndre Swift. The really good freshmen, guys like Trey Blunt, are already in the game plan early on in their freshman years.
Miami, a 3-0 deficit against Florida State right now. Seminoles have kicked the field goal to take a 3-0 lead there. And, boy, I saw some friends on Twitter at that game. They were showing some pictures in the parking lot. There was nobody in the tailgate area for Florida State there early. Seminoles fans have kind of checked out, which actually probably leads us to a discussion we need to have. One of the reasons why Seminoles fans may be a little down right now is not just because of the fate of their team on the field at this moment, but the fate of their most coveted recruit, the 5-star quarterback Justin Fields. I have officially gone as far into the show as I possibly can without mentioning Fields' name after he does commit to Georgia publicly on Friday. Florida State wanted him. Auburn was hoping for him. LSU and Alabama got official visits recently. But Georgia, as you had been saying all along, looked like the team to beat for the Dogs. You never wavered on that. When a lot of the online chatter was about other schools, you kind of, remained steadfast. You thought there was a lot going for Georgia on this. Ultimately, the Dogs do get the news they want yesterday. What was your reaction to having been at Harrison High School? I know you know Fields well. You had a chance to speak to his family yesterday and also Fields himself during the press conference. Just give me your thoughts on what a monumental day it was for UGA recruiting yesterday.
Well, I tell you one thing. I like the true joy that he showed during the private pep rally ceremony when he rips off one jersey, his Harrison one green jersey, and there's a red Georgia jersey underneath it. I remember him making a couple points about He wants to wear the number 1 jersey for Georgia. Sony Michel will be relinquishing that one after holding it onto it for 4 years in Athens. And he hopes maybe he can wear that number 1 for Georgia. I think that's probably going to get done when you're talking about the number 1 overall prospect in the country. A little bit of, I'm going to just kind of say this is right now. I don't think Florida State was ever really in it, especially over the last couple of months of his recruitment. Justin was a little bit candid at his press conference about just exactly what this race looked like. Maybe one of the most important points he made that kind of just put this whole recruiting race in the right sort of kaleidoscope or prism or right filter, whatever you want to call it. I asked him, I said, who was number 2?
Yeah.
And Justin basically had to use that 3.9 GPA and his 29 on his ACT to kind of formulate an answer. And he basically said, man, I really couldn't even give you a number 2 right now. And a guy like me that's had an inkling that Justin Fields might be a Bulldog, maybe even way back as early as May, late May, that's kind of proof positive that Justin Fields wasn't really feeling those Seminoles for quite some time.
And that's one of the reasons why, and I was very honest about this process. There was a long period of time when I was skeptical that Fields was coming to Georgia. But my skepticism disappeared around the time of a few weeks ago when I started realizing, wow, there really doesn't look like a number 2 school right now. The Florida State fans on their own message boards had kind of waved the white flag, which is an indication of kind of, what they were, obviously hearing, feeling, and thinking. There were some, very well-placed sources. I know you wrote about this, that Auburn officially had kind of waved the white flag when it comes to Justin Fields. You didn't hear any chatter coming out of the official visit to Alabama, which is not a usual thing to happen. The LSU official visit was a little more than a sightseeing trip. There really wasn't any public evidence of there being a real number 2, a real contender for Fields. It's almost as if Fields doesn't announce yesterday, there'd be no announcement to make because it was so obvious that he was trending to Georgia here after he took the 2 straight unofficial visits for the Samford game and the Mississippi State game.
Brandon, probably maybe one of my favorite parts of that whole ceremony yesterday at Harrison High was a genuine thing that the Fields and maybe his team or advisors chose to do. A lot of kids like to go through the ceremony and the pomp and circumstances and the theater of actually, the whole hat dance, the table, I'm going to pick out these hats. I think the truest thing Justin could have done is not have a table, not put any hats up there and then reach for the Georgia flat bill or whatever you want to call it, because there really weren't any other hats on the table. And it's so crazy to think that, and this is a positive attaboy, rubber stamp, boldface, underline, italicized thought right here. Georgia really made the race for the nation's number 1 overall prospect a no-brainer.
Yeah, it's really something.
There was no competition. He couldn't even think of a number 2 school. This wasn't close. And Justin and his family also told me this, is they told me in July, they said, we want to look at the season, we want to see some games. And I wrote about this yesterday, and I called it a pre-snap read, where everything he was thinking and he was feeling was going to happen once the season got underway. He wanted to see it verified. He wanted to see Georgia surge out to a 5-6-0 lead. He wanted to see the defense. He wanted to see the offense. He wanted to see special teams.
Yeah.
And it was almost like Georgia didn't buckle under the wave of the season. Auburn took on some water. FSU took on some water. LSU took on some water. Georgia held strong.
I love Earl Wise's comment that the Fields' official visit to LSU was just a scouting trip for next year's game. Is that what it was? Did Fields just go out to Baton Rouge so we get a little intel on the team he knew he was going to be playing in Baton Rouge next year? Maybe that was the case.
Got to take your visits, but there was almost a fatigue point there for the Fields family. They even told me that yesterday, that they reached a point after that Alabama visit where it was almost like, what are we doing here? Why are we spinning our wheels? And one of the main takeaways that Justin said is he doesn't really see himself taking any more officials, doesn't really see himself taking any more unofficials. He said very likely the thing he'll do is you'll see him in Athens every weekend. The Bulldogs are playing football from here on out, and what a recruiting tool that would be when the headline for the recruiting writer has to go, oh yeah, the nation's number 1 prospect is going to be in Athens again as a commitment again.
Yeah, quite a conversation. We got a couple minutes left, a couple things I want to do before we're gone. Before we're done, I got to ask you a very important question. Do you think blackout this Saturday against Missouri? Don't answer it now because I got some other stuff we got to do. But before we're gone, I want your thoughts on, and this will be the first person to bring this up, I guess, this week. Will it be a blackout for Georgia against Missouri in the night game this upcoming Saturday? We'll do that in a moment. Let me make an awkward transition, though, before we get to that. We talk about Fields, there's excitement. You talk about Fromm, and there's still some excitement about him, obviously, as well. Eason does not get a lot of playing time today, comes in and plays. I think for the most part, we'll say that was a disappointment, gives up a sack. That turns into a turnover. That's an opportunity for Vanderbilt to get more points there. Is it obvious now that Eason's the odd man out here? It would seem that he's the clear backup to Fromm at this point. Another 5-star quarterback coming in for next year. Let me just ask a very blunt question. Does Jacob Eason have a future at Georgia?
I think he's going to have to look himself in the mirror, Brandon. I think it's very telling where you see where the one freshman was able to come in and run with the opportunity, and in a way maybe that Jacob Eason hasn't been able to yet. I think when you look at Jacob Eason, I keep saying this a lot, and I do believe it, even though it sounds like the nice guy thing to say, and maybe to massage an ego a little bit. I just think that Eason's best football is somewhere within him. And for whatever reason, there's not been the change agent, there's not been the catalyst to bring that out of him. Now, maybe this will happen this offseason when he sees Jake Fromm and the way he prepares and the way he lifts and the way he studies and what that led him to do on the field his freshman year. Maybe Jacob Eason goes Rocky in the offseason and goes out in the Himalayas or finds himself some North Georgia mountains and trains, just totally dedicates himself to football. And he turns every weakness or maybe weaker strength into his game into a more polished part of his game, because I think he's going to need to with Justin Fields coming in and what Jake Fromm continues to show. Sooner or later, I refer to this term a lot with young players. I call it the grow-up pill. Yeah. I call it there's a moment in their career, there's a moment in their training and in their rise to where they're going to be as a football player. There's a moment where they decide it's all on me. I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to eliminate every possible obstacle or excuse I might have. And maybe Jacob Eason finds that in the offseason. Yeah. Maybe he doesn't like being the backup. Maybe he doesn't like seeing all this talent. He's got NFL dreams for sure. And maybe he's going to make a line in the stand and he's going to say, you know what? I'm going to make myself the very best possible quarterback I can be, not just for NFL millions, but also to help the Georgia football program.
Diedrich Frazier says the light just hasn't come on for Eason. That's agreeing with what you said. I think the light still can come on for him, though. I mean, I think that it's unfair to judge him by brief football moments, even if they haven't been good. Today, an example of that, the brief window against Tennessee, the same thing. The first 2 drives against Appalachian State, all not good. But to judge Eason on the basis of just those brief moments, I think is unfair. Right now, Fromm is supposed to be the quarterback for Georgia. Leighton Lewis said that in the comment section, and I agree with Leighton on that. This is Fromm's team for now, but I don't think that college football should give up on Eason yet, and I can't promise you that his good moments will happen in a Georgia uniform, but I think Eason still has plenty of opportunities to have good moments in his college career, but it is one of those things that, fair or not, you're going to be watching here over the course of the next few months because Georgia's getting more crowded at the quarterback position, and that, for the moment, would look not to be good news for Jacob Eason. Speaking of also not good news, Solomon Kinley does leave today's game. And, this is one of those kind of on-again, off-again stories for Georgia where Kinley's just had a hard time staying healthy. But when he's in the game, he's an incredibly effective offensive lineman. I think you got to give Kirby Smart and Sam Pittman credit for identifying Kinley for the class of 2016. And I think this week, leading into the Missouri game, and then thinking about Florida for a couple of weeks, a fully 100% healthy Kinley, I think, is going to be crucial in that game against Florida. Seeing Kinley step out for a little bit today, I think another reason to give some Georgia fans a little bit of pause.
Well, I think with Kinley, it looks like he's just got the same nagging things that he's always had all season. It's something that keeps him out for a little bit, but it doesn't appear to be a long-term injury with Solomon Kinley. I just go back to the things that Georgia was supposed to correct for 2017. Special teams, definitely can we say that's been corrected? Yeah. Nobody's hemming and hawing about the offensive line, even with some injuries to Kinley along the way. That offensive line is at least a stable unit right now. You saw so many plays here in this game where, like, Andrew Thomas or Lamont Galliard or other guys were running down the field, leading the way for their running backs. Sometimes they were pushing the pile and everything else like that. And also, maybe Georgia doesn't have the receivers that Alabama has. That won't come until 2019, Brandon.
Oh, yeah. When it comes, it's going to come in a big way, by the way.
Yeah, that won't come until 2019. But what they do have, especially with the connection and the kinship that Fromm has built, they do have some quick stripe and some big stripe, deep ball capabilities through the air in the vertical passing game.
You do realize, and I know you realize this, but I'll just say this here real quickly. When Georgia plays in the fall of 2019, there is a very good chance that Georgia's offense will feature the nation's former number 1 quarterback, former number 1 running back, and former number 1 wide receiver on the field at the same time.
And then they're going to have the number 2 wide receiver, the number 3 running back, the number 1 offensive guard, maybe the number 2 offensive guard. They're going to have a lot of arrows in the quiver for everything else. And 2019 Georgia football is going to look like it's going to look like a lot like all these other football games they're playing right now. Some fans, even the diehards that make every trip to Georgia, are going to find themselves wanting to check out in the middle of the third quarter and say, let's go have some wings, let's go have some beer, let's go out to the Strip in Nashville and enjoy a weekend in Music City.
So LSU does find the end zone against Florida. Are we looking at a 7-0 score here? LSU up 7-0 over the Florida Gators at the moment. I'll take that as good news. And I'll make just one more brief statement about recruiting. So this is actually the least talented Georgia team for the foreseeable future. Definitely. I mean, if you're an SEC team hoping to get Georgia, I hate to say this, you better get them right now. Because the 2018 team, the 2019 team are going to be much more talented than the 2017 version of the Georgia Bulldogs is. And a lot of people joke with me on Twitter all the time saying, what are y'all going to talk about, mainly meaning me, now that Justin Fields is committed, because I've spent so much time asking you about Fields. And what I tweeted back to a few people over the last 24 hours is, listen, the real story here is not Fields. The real story is the people that Fields is bringing to Georgia with him. As much as I'm excited about Fields, the actual story is about to begin. I mean, it's the tidal wave of talent coming after Fields that's going to be really the big story of the 2018 recruiting class.
Well, Brandon, you're gonna love this, man. I say this sometimes in on the DL or on the slide, but there is a very, very possible reality where Georgia only has 3 of their top 11 final commitments for 2018 in the fold right now.
Hold on. Listen to what he said there, y'all. Listen to what he said. And we'll talk about blackout, I promise. And I know we're running late, so we'll do this quick. But just listen to what Jeff just said there. Of the 11 biggest recruits that Georgia is likely to sign with the class of 2018, Jeff just said only 3 of them are currently UGA commits. That means Florida State, Georgia may be coming for one of your big commits. Alabama, Georgia may be coming for one of your big commits.
Miami, Georgia may be coming for one of your big commits.
Miami, Georgia may be coming for one of yours. And some of these other programs like LSU who has certain guys earmarked, that guy may not be there for you when you actually get ready to go do that. There are going to be a lot of broken hearts around the South if this train really gets rolling the way that right now it looks like it might be.
Michigan, Georgia might be coming for one of your big commits. And I'm just going to say this. I'm not going to name all the names there, but when Georgia's final class roster for 2018 is all said and done and signed and sealed, Georgia might only have 3 of their 11 highest rated prospects at this time. And I think it's my job to come out with words and say words that kind of sparkle on a print or on a page. But for a Georgia football fan, that's got to be very tantalizing to think about that maybe a Mr. White, maybe a Mr. Fields, maybe those 2 guys are 2 of the top 10 commitments that Georgia will eventually have for 2018.
All right, we're very late, so let me squeeze this in real quick because I asked you about the possibility for a blackout. Do you think Georgia will black out against Missouri? The reaction I've got in the comment section was actually not what I expected it to be. Joey Smiley says a blackout's not needed against Missouri. John Hardwick also not in favor of Georgia blacking out that game against Missouri. Terry Fountain says Missouri wears black. South Carolina, to a certain degree, wears black as well. That'd make those games feel like home games. But y'all got to understand this. Georgia's going to wear the black jerseys once this year. Now, I'm a traditionalist. I want Georgia in the red. It's a lot of the people I hear from on Dog Nation Daily every single week who like the idea of Georgia wearing the black jerseys. They're going to wear them against somebody, and I've also heard from some of y'all that you don't want to see Georgia wear those in a day game. There's a really good chance that South Carolina or Kentucky will be day games. If you want to wear the black jerseys at night, Missouri may be your last chance to do that here for the 2017 season. And Georgia's not going to use it as a motivational ploy. They're going to pick what looks to be weak, overmatched opponent. Not that you overlook Missouri. Y'all know what I mean by this. Georgia's going to be 3-touchdown favorite next week. That's the kind of game that that Georgia's going to wear the black jerseys in. So do you think black jerseys are a good idea against Missouri? Because I'm really surprised. A lot of our Dixie Vodka postgame show audience doesn't seem to think so right now.
Big fan of like the black jerseys when the weather's a little bit colder. I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of them announcing it well in advance. I'm sure that the snarky wise guy in me could say, why don't they just wear them for the Georgia Tech game? Because maybe Georgia Tech games are Georgia Tech usually wears light, wears the lighter uniform.
You could wear black at Tech.
You could wear black at Tech, but I can guarantee you, if Georgia faces Alabama in the SEC championship game, they're not wearing those black jerseys that day.
The blackout will not be a part of that. By the way, another score to give you. Notre Dame has taken a 7-0 lead over UNC. I don't know if anybody in the room knows Brandon Wimbush, the quarterback, was thought to be questionable today. Maybe in our comment section we know if Wimbush is playing today. But a Georgia win this season that continues to look better is that game against Notre Dame. The Irish have really been rolling since then, including off to a 7-0 lead here against UNC.
Yeah, I didn't think we were sounding outlandish, Brandon, when we were celebrating the Dixie Vodka postgame show, and you got there by a fire truck from Wabash County, I guess, or was that correct? How you got to?
It's Mishawga. I can never say that right. Mishawga, Indiana. Yeah.
Yeah. The point I'm going to make there is we were kind of chopping it up after that victory, and I thought to myself, Notre Dame looks like a top 10 team, a top 15 team, a 10-win football team, and as the season begins to play out, we can certainly see all of that.
A lot of comments coming in the comment section. Brandon Wimbush not playing for Notre Dame today, but the Irish have a 7-0 lead over North Carolina. All right, let's do this. Let me remind you one more time. That's Jeff Sentell. My name's Brandon Adams, and we have a very special thank you to you for being with us for the Dixie Vodka postgame show each and every week here on the Dog Nation Facebook page. Of course, the Dixie Vodka postgame show brought to you by our friends at Dixie Vodka. They are the South's best tasting vodka. You know, here in the South, we debate a lot of things when it comes to this sport this time of year, but there is no debate about Dixie Vodka. As I said, it is the South's best tasting vodka. All right, big news around college football today. Oklahoma does lose. Georgia very likely to officially be, at least according to the polls for right now, in the top 4 when these things come out at the on Sunday. Florida LSU playing right now. We'll see how that shakes out. And by the way, Clemson's starting quarterback Kelly Bryant, he goes down today. A really monumental, interesting college football Saturday, and it's really fun to think as you move towards the next few weeks. Georgia very much in the thick of this national conversation right now.
What a difference a year makes, Brandon. I think that says a lot there just with that simple statement right there.
All right, so very special thanks to everybody who kind of gets the Dixie Vodka postgame show on the air here for us. Don't forget, Jeff, all week long, we'll have the Sentell Intel. He'll be covering UGA recruiting, including the aftermath of Justin Fields' decision to commit to Georgia on Friday. I'll be back with Dog Nation Daily, live on video at 10 a.m. and then the podcast after that at dognation.com. Hope you all have a great weekend. We'll look forward to seeing you again real soon right here on the Dixie Vodka postgame show.